Actual recording is higher quality. Okay, good to know. By the way, we're still getting used to. For the audience who's unaware, we're using this Riverside thing that JT somehow stumbled upon to create us to give us a more impression of being higher quality than we really are, which is a lovely experience. All right, today has been a interesting day. Today is the 7th of October. It's been a year since a certain event has happened.
What event? I don't know what you're talking about. I don't know what
Exactly
you're
right.
talking
Yeah.
about.
But in an interesting range of I don't know exactly what you would call it, but I guess like revenge takedowns. There's been plenty of channels and whatnot that have been shut down, particularly people who do Palestine activism. I don't want to just start listing them because just a few of them have gotten some nonsense. But
What,
I
seriously,
keep
today?
yeah,
Today
yeah,
or
yeah,
like a
yeah,
year
exactly
ago
right.
today?
No,
Because a
today,
year ago
today, on the
today, and
day.
for like 2 3 months, if you
Yeah.
remember, both on YouTube, but almost every
Mm,
platform that I can think of,
yeah.
Twitter as well, they were just getting
Mm,
banned left and right
mm,
for even some tweets that were like from 3 to 4 years
mm.
ago, and now
Yeah.
today it's on repeat. That is
Yeah,
wild.
yeah, yeah, it's gonna continue. But that's it's this is a good sign because it just shows that they lose control of the narrative, so they have to resort to these mechanisms. Let's move aside from that slightly more depressing topic to discuss a unfamiliar but familiar face. This beautiful man that we have with us. If you're not used to JT's Honduran salesman fit and Yugo's Balkan Balkan conflict fit and my non-existent floating land head, we have a very nicely dressed gentleman with us. I've always been meaning to ask you this, Victor. What is with the dapper fits? You always look fantastic, but it's is it direct? Like, tell us about it, please.
Yes,
Why do you
I
look so good? Basically, that's what Hakeem is asking
Exactly
me.
right.
well, I guess that this is something that usually people find interesting because
Mm,
there's this idea that Marxists they should be wearing like I don't know like fully very bad clothes and the likes. But I think that I've always liked to dress
mm,
in a very nice type of way. I
mm,
enjoy fine dressing.
mm,
And I also thought that it would be something that would shock people to some extent,
mm,
right? And I like shocking
mm,
people, so this is primarily my choice of outfit.
mm. I love it. It's
Same.
something that's interesting. I don't know if it's the same in the Balkans. In my parts of the world, I'm from the West Asian region. Generally, I'm from Iraq, like specifically. It's very common for young people, especially university educated and whatnot, particularly in the university setting, to dress in suits and have them pressed and look nice and whatnot. And it doesn't look larpy, doesn't look weird. You don't look like who's that? The dork. The Ben Shapiro. Kinda. Yeah. It doesn't come off like that. It comes off very genuine. It's a very common thing still. I'm assuming in Latin America, it's the same thing. Balkans, I have absolutely no idea.
No, at this point, after the 90s, absolutely not. I mean, we wear our suit, but our suit as a tracksuit. So, it's just, it's the subjective definition of what is a suit. But yeah, but it's very, very common on all 18th birthdays, weddings, special moments, et
Confirmation, stuff
cetera.
like
And
that. Yeah.
obviously people that work in academia, absolutely. And also there's a lot of people that just dress well, and dress elegantly because they prefer to dress well and
Yeah.
dress elegantly. It's a
As it should be.
it's
Yeah.
a it's a subjective aesthetic choice which should always be respected. From my point of view, like, I always will treat you a little bit better when I see that you treat yourself with respect. That is just a green flag from every single direction that you can kind of lift up towards
Lennon
me.
has never been. Lennon has never been caught slacking. There's not one fit that man did not slaughter. All right. So we support and we stand nice fashion politics on here. Not fast fashion, nice fashion. Clear difference. All right. I was gonna ask you, Victor. Originally, I mean, I don't know if feel free if you to tell us if you don't want to talk about it or not. But originally, are you brought up in the U.S.? Are you from outside the United States? Because I believe you study in New York.
Yeah, so I am originally from Madrid, Spain, and this is where I've been most of my life.
Hmm.
I lived in Ireland
Hmm.
for about a year and a half, more or
Hmm.
less. But when I started university, I went to study to NYU. And I actually studied in China for the first 2 years.
Oh, wow.
I studied at the Shanghai campus.
I remember you mentioned before, yeah.
Exactly. And it was a really nice experience, really eye-opening experience. I feel that it solidified a lot of the ideas that I was already coming in from high school. And it really helped me develop a lot, both personally and academically. And then in my time in New York, I also had some really wonderful experiences there. I will probably be speaking about some of them today throughout the presentation if they do come up, if some anecdotes or stuff comes up. But yeah, I mean, my experience in NYU was amazing. Really good university for studying economics, even though the curriculum, it's the orthodox neoclassical curriculum. You don't really see that much of a Marxist positions in these courses. But I did find it very interesting to study them. And at NYU, I did find some resources that were helpful. Although I must say that much of the research that I've done it on my own.
Yeah, I'm completely not surprised. There's the heresy of studying political economy is ever present, particularly in American business and economics segments. To my knowledge, it's less so in Europe. Again, to my knowledge, and much less so elsewhere in the world. Marxism as an economic discipline is still it's always been respected as a tradition. Just in North America, they try to pretend it doesn't exist, like children. Alright, hello everybody and welcome back to the program. Today we have our ever magnificent Victor Magariño, which I believe is how you pronounce your last name? Yep. Hyper overly American pronunciation because I don't want to insult you by doing an accent.
I must say that was a really good pronunciation of my surname, as for English standards. So
okay, there you go.
Congratulate you on that.
So he called me Anglo in a subtle way. Anyways, so all right, Victor is a published Marxist economist who has also a lovely nugget of a YouTube channel full of incredibly useful and dense videos, which we'll link, of course. It's particularly regarding the scientific approach to Marxist economics and various adjacent topics, but he also absolutely he demolishes and decides to shred in very, very intricate manners quite a bit, from the Austrian school of fairy tales to much more. But in a very respectful way. I dare say way too respectful for the subject matter, but I guess you're just that kind of guy. He's also a very dapper dude, as you see, and has never looked as dazzling as he does today. Hello, Victor.
I'm really grateful to be here, as I was saying before, and I really enjoy your content whenever I have the time to watch it, so it's a pleasure for me to be here. If you want, you can find me on YouTube, searching my name, Victor Magariño. You can also find me in Twitter, and if you want, you can also find me in some academic forums where articles are published and the like.
And we'll include all those links in the description, of course. I want us to jump right into the meat, and it's one of the main reasons that I want to get you on. It's two things, actually, but we're going to get to them. The first of which that I want to touch on is the bread and butter of Marxist economics, which is the labor theory of value, which I hope everybody is aware of. I think it was covered in one of our very early episodes, but I would like you, if you could, Victor, to kind of walk us through what it is, the basic theoretical foundation of it, and then walk us through, if you could, the material evidence for the labor theory of value. Is there empirical evidence for it? Has it been verified? Are there possibly some modern fancy interpretations, particularly with how labor is operationalized? Walk us maybe through some criticisms. Just give us the whirlwind.
Yeah, so this is a really important question and really fundamental for economic analysis, because usually theories of value are the foundation for our understanding of the way in which capitalist societies work, right? So having a very solid foundation, like I believe the labor theory of value provides us with, it's really important. It's really important to understand it and to understand its details as well. And it's also really important to be able to defend it on both theoretical and empirical grounds, right? Because you hear a lot of criticisms to the labor theory of value, which are generally misguided. They are directed at strawman versions of the labor theory of value.
Mud pie.
Exactly, yeah, that type of argument. Recently, I was in a debate where this was essentially the kind of counter arguments that I was being offered. So,
Of course.
so
What did Lenin say about the reactionaries pose a straw man of Marxism and then triumphantly defeat it? And then, yeah, exactly right. No, please go on.
Yeah, exactly. So let me try to give as summarized and as precise of a version of the labor theory of value as I can think of at the moment. So if we want to understand, okay, many economic phenomena, we have to start from this foundational ground, right? Which is, what is economic value? Where does it come from? And what are its most immediate implications, right? And here I'm hinting at the theory of exploitation, right? Because it is from the labor theory of value that we derive the theory of exploitation, right? All right, so the labor theory of value, first of all, we need to understand that it applies in a very specific set of social, in a very specific social context, with a very specific set of social relations, right? And this context can vary in some things, but the most fundamental feature of the social context in which the law of value emerges is market economies. Now, let me make a distinction between two main types of market economies, okay? One is more or less theoretical, the other one is a more actual type of economy. The theoretical one is the simple exchange or the simple production economy, right? Where there's no class division, so workers, let's say, they produce everything that they sell, and everything that they sell is exactly their income, right? There's no surplus value in this sense. Now, because there are market economies, we expect the labor theory of value to apply in this type of society, but we also expect it to apply in capitalist societies, where there is a division of the total product between wages and profits, that is, between the working class and between the capitalist class, right? And capitalists, of course, can also engage in production activities, right? We are not saying that capitalists do not do anything productive in capitalist societies. What we say is that as a class, okay, they are the owners of the means of production, and therefore they are the passive earners of income that is generated from production. But in practice, many capitalists also engage in production activities.
Yeah.
It's important to notice that.
I would just like to give a little interjection. A very beautiful overview, but when it comes to the division between productive and non-productive labor, there is the colloquial understanding of what productive means, as in serving a positive end or a useful end. But in economic terms, productive means literally related to production, as in producing a good at the end. For example, lawyers are non-productive labor. They don't produce an actual physical thing, a gadget, a gizmo or something like that at the end, but they still have services that they render. Doesn't mean that in the colloquial term their work isn't productive, just means in the manufacturing sense. That's what we mean in economics. Please continue, Victor.
Exactly. And even within a specific profession, the workers may engage in both productive and unproductive activities, right? If you have, let's say, I like to give this example, right? You have a person in a store that is assembling a specific product in such a way that it is sellable, right? They are like polishing some of the details of the commodity. They are making it in the right shape, in the right form, with the right smell, detail, all of those details, right? That is engaging in production activity because it is shaping a commodity to become a final product, right? But then let's say that they also engage in the activity of transferring the commodity to the consumer and receiving the money from the consumer, right? That transferring activity is not a production activity. It is simply an activity that is in a sense in the realm of the transfer of titles over commodities, but it's not producing any commodities over and above what already exists, right? So even within the same profession, you can have, or the same person can do both production and non-production activities, which at a micro level, it's easy to see. At a macro level, it's more complicated to differentiate. And so more like strict categories have to be imposed at a macro level. And there's a lot of theoretical work on what constitutes production and non-production activities when you look at it through the lens of like big industries. All right. But going back again to the labor theory of value. So we already understand what is the context in which it applies, right? Which is the basic context of generalized exchange economies, that is market economies, where everything is up for sale, or most things are up for sale. Now, the law of value arises as an emergent property from the interaction of heterogeneous agents in these types of societies. And it is mediated, it is regulated by competition. So it is really important to understand that another theoretical foundation of the labor theory of value is that of competition. Competition is really important. And in particular, is competition conceived of not as an equilibrium state, but as a process of turbulent regulation. Okay, turbulent regulation. If we consider this type of economies, again, with the competition element added to them and a realistic notion of competition, meaning as a process, not as a state where things just get immediately equalized, then we can start to ask questions about, okay, so what is it that happens in these types of economies? We see that from the chaos of these types of economies, because you have a lot of sellers and buyers, producers, consumers, you have competition, you have cost cutting, price setting, you have all of these things that are happening in the background, but suddenly you start to see some kind of a, let's say, of a regularity to emerge, right? And usually this regularity is expressed in many different ways, but we can see it in the proportions with which commodities exchange, right? So commodities tend to exchange in relatively stable proportions, and this gives us the let's say the theoretical backing to suggest that they have a fundamental quantitative worth, right? At any given moment in time, a commodity has a price, a market price, and that is determined by many short-run influences, including like disequilibrating factors between supply and demand, etc. But there is a fundamental quantitative worth to those commodities, which explains its market price in the long run. Okay, its competitive market price. And this is what we're trying to explain with the labor theory of value. And our proposed theory says that the fundamental value of commodities is determined by the socially necessary labor time that is required for their production. Okay,
Exactly
this is the conclusion. Why is the labor in this sense better than other substances like preferences? There are three
referring to the
main
subjective theory of value.
Exactly. There are three
Very
main
good
reasons.
to address, nonetheless. Yeah.
There are three main reasons. Okay. First, it's that the quantitative, so commodities, when they get exchanged in quantitative proportions, right? That we can measure, that we can store in data sets, that we can look at through time. The second is that these proportions indicate that commodities have some universal thing in common when they're being exchanged, right? It's a property that they all have in common, the property of commensurability, the property of being capable of being exchanged. And this is a universal property across commodities. And the more generalized that the market is, the more generalized that this property also is, right? And the next thing is that exchange is a social process, right? So usually you can see this in an isolated, purely individualistic fashion, but it's not going to tell you how actual exchanges in actual economies work, right? Where they involve social processes, where they involve a certain set of social relations that, again, cannot be understood outside of a specific social context. So then we ask, does the labor value of a commodity meet this criteria? Is it a quantifiable property? Is it a universal property across commodities? And is it a social property of commodities? And to all of these things, we can say yes. Now, what about subjective valuations of commodities? Are they quantifiable? They can't be quantified, right?
Exactly
Because
right.
subjective preferences are purely, depending on who you ask, but they are purely individualistic, idiosyncratic, they cannot be measured, they cannot be quantified, right? Only the person that has them, if you want to be like that, only that person can know what they are. But depending on who you ask, maybe they don't even know. Even the people that have them don't even know. Okay, the next thing is, are they universal? Clearly not. I mean, obviously, the property of satisfying human needs and wants is universal across commodities, right? So that property is universal. But what is not universal is the specific needs and wants that the commodities meet, that the commodities satisfy, right? So clearly the subjective preferences cannot be universalized in the same way that we can do with the labor costs, with the labor values. And the next thing is, are they social? Are subjective preferences social? And here my contention is that even though they are influenced by society, they nevertheless are still subjective, idiosyncratic, so they are not a social substance.
Exactly right.
And there is a very simple case in which we can see why this fails, why the subjective theory of value fails, right? And this is a very simple exchange, right? I always tend to give this exchange, where you have two people, they have some commodity, each has a different commodity, and they exchange those commodities, right? And let's say that they exist in a society, right, in a market economy, and those commodities are worth, both of them are worth $10. So there is an exchange between equals, an equivalent, an exchange between equivalents, right? All right, let's consider this scenario. What does the subjective theory of value tell us? What is the most thing that it can tell us about this scenario? At best, it can tell us that the reason why the exchange took place is because both people, the two people in this scenario, were expecting higher utility from the product that they obtained from the exchange than the utility that they were receiving already from the product that they had, right? So there is an unequal, there's an inequality in utilities that explains, in this sense, why the exchange took place. But it's not telling you why both commodities are worth $10. That's something that it's not telling you, because before the exchange they were worth $10, and after the exchange they're still worth $10, even though aggregate utility increased. Right? Aggregate utility is now higher than it was before in this ideal scenario, but let's say the price, the quantitative worth of those commodities is still the same. So we need something that it remains constant throughout the exchange, and that is the value in labor terms of those commodities. So this is the fundamental aspects of the theory. There are a lot more nuances, but this is more or less the fundamentals.
Yeah.
Right?
But before we move on from the topic of subjective theory of value, I just want to give my one little example that I tend to like to give, which is kind of diverges in two ways. The subjective theory of value exists almost solely to distract and to kind of pull away from the labor theory of value. That's its only purpose of existence. And it's formulated in a way where it distorts use value and supply and demand of a particular commodity in order to arrive at some nonsensical idea of what the quote-unquote value of a particular commodity is. The reason it specifically sets on these two variables is to remove labor entirely from the equation. But that doesn't, for example, the subjective theory of value, in essence, has absolutely zero explanatory power in real life, no matter how complex of a market economy you have, for the prices of commodities, right? At the end of the day, of course, supply and demand plays a role, but the theoretical example is, imagine if supply and demand were completely equalized, what would the price of the commodity be? And then they have no answer, because subjectivity does not, in the market, subjectivity doesn't actually play an active role in the determination of prices. The cars are objectively more expensive than pencils, for example, and that is because, given supply and demand being equalized in both cases, the car will be more expensive than the pencil. The reasoning for this is because the amount of labor, as well as these other additions that are put onto the theory, going into the particular commodities, is wildly different. That is the fundamental underpinning of this entire of the objectivity of the labor theory of value in comparison to the subjective theory of value. Please go on, Victor.
Yeah, and something that I should say here is that even for those people who are raised in the intellectual tradition of neoclassical economics, even those people that are taught the standard models that we are all taught in university, they can still make sense of what we are saying here, because even in neoclassical economics, there is, as it were, a cost theory of value that is ultimately arrived by this tradition, right? And this takes the following form. So this is the question for anybody that studies microeconomics: what is the long run competitive price in a market, right? This is the basic question. And the neoclassical answer is that the long-run competitive price is determined by the production of that commodity, right? It's determined by the minimum point of the average cost curve. So it is the costs that determine the long-run price. So the demand in the long run only determines, in the neoclassical model, only determines the quantity of the thing that is sold, right? If there is more demand, more quantity will be sold. If there is less demand, less quantity will be sold. But the price is determined by the minimum point of the average cost curve, and that is the neoclassical answer to the long-run competitive prices. So even they have some version of a cost theory of value.
It's two
This is
steps
the reason why.
removed from a redefining of the labor theory of value. Really, it's pathetic, honestly, the way they go around.
It's much worse because their notion of the competitive price is really idealistic and really static in its own conception, right? Because the model is idealistic because it's presenting some hyper rational agents that maximize their utility and some aggregate firm that has this aggregate production function that has this price, etc. And it's also positing this notion of perfect competition, which is really, let's say, vague and really poorly defined and poorly conceptualized. A much better notion of competition is the notion of real competition, which is the one that I defend theoretically. But even this, the orthodox school of economics today has this insight embedded into their theoretical system, which is really ironic because usually neoclassical economists would be very critical of Marx for the transformation problem and all that, but they also had this same transformation problem, and they also ended in a conclusion that was similar in spirit to the conclusion of Marx, but very different because it is grounded on a very different theoretical building block that is obviously far worse than the one that we are defending.
Beautifully put. Could you please move on to the, of course, at your own rate and with what you'd like to tell us, but the material of it, the empirical picture of the labor theory of value as it currently stands, at the very least.
Yeah. So my contention is that the labor theory of value is the most empirically studied theory of value that we have seen so far in the economics profession, and it is also the one that has received the highest empirical support. Not just because it's the only one, but because all of its main predictions have been consistently met with empirical support, right? There's three main predictions that the labor theory of value makes. There's a cross-sectional prediction which says that at a cross-sectional level, right? If you look at an economy in a particular year and you look at its cross-sectional structure, meaning all of its industries, the average prices in those industries are going to be determined by the average labor costs in those industries, right? That's the basic idea of the cross-sectional hypothesis. There are two main ways of testing this. One is with regression analysis, another one is with measures of vector distance. And ultimately, depending on how you look at it, these two different ways of studying this question can actually lead to different hypotheses in themselves. But for simplicity, let's just say that there's two ways of testing this, right? Usually, what people say is that usually, okay, when you tell people, okay, there's empirical support for the labor theory of value, what they will tell you is, oh no, but that is spurious correlations, right? Now, what are they talking about? Usually people don't know what they are talking about. They just say it because they have read it in a forum or whatever. What are they actually talking about? They are talking about the work of Andrew Kleiman and the work of Nitzan and Bichler, which suggests that regression analysis for cross-sectional correlations between prices and values is spurious. This is what they claim, right? And what does it mean for a correlation to be spurious? It means that the correlation doesn't, it's not indicative of a causal process, but rather it is indicative of a statistical relationship that is attained through a mediating variable that it is not in the model itself, right? Yeah. So it is a variable that you're omitting from the model that is explaining the relationship that you see between these two things. And what is this variable they claim? The industry size, right? The industry size. However you want to measure that, because that's also a question. How do you measure industry size? Is it by the output? Is it by the costs? Is it by any other measure? All right, so this is the idea. Now, I believe, okay, that there is some truth to this argument in the cross-sectional correlations, okay, which is that it is true that the size, or let's say the output of the industries, which cannot be controlled for in the regression for statistical reasons that are a little bit complicated, but for statistical reasons we cannot control for the output, and this output adds some degree of bias in these regressions, right? But this bias is small, and we can see that this bias is small because if we apply the same methodology to other inputs, right, instead of testing the labor theory of value, let's test the energy theory of value, where instead of using labor as the input that you are testing, you are using some bundle of goods that involve energy or just electricity or whatever, right? Now, if we do this, we see that the regressions are no longer as high as with the labor inputs, which suggests that there is some degree of bias, but nevertheless, those cross-sectional correlations are indicating something fundamental, an actual relationship.
Exactly right.
Because if you use the same methodology for other inputs, you don't get as high of a correlation coefficient. But setting that aside, I don't even think that this is the best cross-sectional evidence, because we have evidence coming from measures of vector distance, where what we do is we calculate the competitive prices in an economy based on the labor values, and we measure how close these competitive prices are to the actual market prices.
Exactly.
And if we do this, we see that they are usually very close together, right? And this is what the measures of vector distance tell us, which is not the same as a correlation, right? A correlation is testing how the movements in one vector correlate with the movements in the other. What we want to see is how close these vectors are to each other. And this is a different way of testing it, which is not spurious in the sense that because it is not a correlation, it cannot be a spurious correlation, right? So has this been tested in many different countries across many different years? Yes. So it is not just one study that I can point you to, it is many studies, and it is studies done on many economies, on many capitalist economies, including China, including the Chinese economy, right? So even in the Chinese economy, the labor theory of value is empirically sound. Now, this is not the only prediction, right? There's a time series prediction. Changes in the relative prices of commodities are going to be explained by changes in the relative labor values throughout time. We also see, and here we can use regression analysis. It has been used. There is no spurious correlation problem in these time series regressions for statistical reasons, again. And this relationship is still found, right, at a time series level. And there is a structural hypothesis. Okay, this one is a little bit more nuanced, but the basic idea is that even in the face of big changes in the distribution of total output between wages and profits, which are theorized that they could potentially lead to big distortions in the relationship between labor values and prices, even in the face of big changes in this distribution, we still see that labor values are the determinants of relative prices, right? Relative labor values are still the determinants of relative prices of commodities. So we have a big let's say, body of empirical evidence that corroborates the hypothesis of the labor theory of value. And this is and let me stress this again, this is the only theory of value that has been empirically tested on a consistent basis, and it is the only one that has been met consistently also by empirical success.
Exactly right. Beautiful, beautiful overview of that. One source that I like to recommend is Paul Cockshott has several compiled series on empirical evidence for the labor theory of value, but the research is generally interestingly overwhelming in the positive alignments between 94 and 98%, depending on the economy and depending on the particular variables they use to investigate. And this has been recreated not only on entire economy bases, but also on particular industries measured. And this has been done in South Korea, Norway and Sweden, the United States, as you mentioned, the Chinese economy, several Latin American economies as well. It's a very heavily studied thing, as Victor mentioned. And what's even more interesting is the significant weight of the findings. Of course, the minor distortions that you see, these 2 to 4% that don't align to make it fully 100%, is because of like secondary variables or other simple variable distortions. It's part of it. The discussion gets very deep into the research. The most important point is there is nothing that gets even close to the explanatory power and also empirical verifiability of the labor theory of value. We don't want to just throw numbers at the audience to make their head spin, but it is something that we would recommend people look into actively.
Exactly. I would just like to add a little bit of, let's say, a caveat here, because some proponents of the subjective theory of value, and remember there are different subjective theories of value, right? But some proponents of the subjective theory of value will point to an experiment that was conducted on like university students, where the basic gist of the experiment is that if you give a set of students a reservation price, right, meaning like, let's say the highest price at which you would be willing to pay for a given good, if you give students this and you put them in a specific experimental environment, what has been observed is that generally the reservation prices will taken as a proxy for the subjective valuations of these students, okay, will generally tend to regulate the proportions with which the commodities exchange in that particular experimental environment, right? So there has been some, let's say, experiments done on the subjective theory of value, but those are not actually testing the subjective theory of value, because in that experiment the reservation prices are given, right? So like the preferences that people have to act upon, if you want to view it like this, they are given by the experimenter, right? It's not as if it arises spontaneously from some like actual inner preferences. It is some externally imposed preferences that people act upon. I just want to say that because usually there is this evidence given. This is one experiment, by the way. It's not like this has been corroborated many times. But if you want to look at this question at a macroeconomic level, surely the subjective theory of value is going to be untestable.
Exactly right. Beautifully put. Thank you for that lovely overview. We can talk probably for over an hour or two about the labor theory of value, but I want to get to some more juicy questions. I want to strain the how polite you can be when engaging with the absolute stupidity of various economic schools. So let's move on to maybe arguably the biggest meme that exists within economy that somehow holds massive sway over practically every economic education program, particularly in North America, but especially also certain government bureaus across Europe and particularly the United States, and that being the Austrian School of Economics. Could you just kind of give us a quick rundown, not really much about the history of it, but specifically the particular fixation and popularity of the school and its foundational deficiencies, let's say?
Yeah, so the first thing that we should notice when talking about the Austrian School of Economics is that it is also a heterodox school, right? It is not the orthodox School of Economics today. And neoclassical economists are some of the best critics of Austrian economics in certain regards, right? Especially when it comes to like preference theory and the like. Now, what is Austrian economics, right? Let's start from this very basic premise, because Austrian economics encompasses
economics written in German, yes. Sorry, Austrians viewing, in Austrian, apology.
I would say that the main distinctive features of the Austrian School of Economics are probably the following, right? So we have to talk about methodological individualism, or an individualistic methodology, which stresses the importance of taking as a starting point some abstract notion of an individual. That is one of the key defining features of this School of Economics. Another one is what we can call some type of a radical subjectivism, where individuals act based on some preferences that are highly subjective to the point of being basically untestable and completely unfalsifiable, because in neoclassical economics, again, depending on who you talk to, because there's research on different sides of this debate, but usually when you talk to neoclassical economists, they will tell you that their axioms of consumer behavior can be empirically tested. And when they have been empirically tested, they have been shown to be incorrect. For most of the literature in behavioral economics, that is exactly what we find. But the Austrians go a step further, which they say, no empirical tests of our theory of subjective preferences can actually be done because these preferences are highly idiosyncratic to the point of being basically unfalsifiable. We cannot detach our actions from our preferences. So there's no way whatsoever in which we can test whether it is our preferences that determine our actions or not. This is very, very important to keep in mind. So some type of a radical subjectivism is also a key defining feature of the Austrian School of Economics. And another one would be some kind of a praxeology, right? Some notion of praxeology. Now, not all Austrian economists are praxeologists, and especially in the strict sense of praxeology, right? But what
Please define for the audience.
So praxeology is this idea that you can study all of economics from the starting point of axioms that are logically true, and you can logically derive all of economic theory from those starting axioms, right? Without the need for empirical evidence.
And that's the key point.
Yeah.
without empirical evidence, Please continue.
Exactly. So usually Austrians will tell you that using some kind of a Kantian epistemology, they will tell you that there is these things called a priori synthetic statements, right? Which are statements that are true a priori of any experience, but they also give us information about the real world, right? It's very important because statements can be a priori in the sense of being true by definition almost, right? As in like a bachelor is an unmarried man, but they don't tell us anything about the real world unless you add empirical content into those things, right? When you say A equals A, that is logically true, but it doesn't mean anything unless you put something into that formal structure, like I am myself, right? So this would be the empirical version of that particular statement, right? But okay, the main thing is that they believe that there are things that are definitionally correct, true, definitionally true, and at the same time meaningful, in the sense that they express things about the real world, and in particular about the real behavior of human beings. Not all Austrian economists are praxeologists. In fact, the most prominent, some of the most prominent Austrian economists, like Hayek, almost in a very direct and straightforward manner, reject praxeology. They still retain some type of a logical, deductive, reasoning type of process to their economic theories, which is the good part of their economic theories, to be honest. But nevertheless, they do not believe that these things are completely unfalsifiable, that we can deduce everything from the starting point of these axioms, etc. Right? So the best Austrian economists actually reject praxeology to some degree. And this actually has been the source of a lot of debate within the Austrian School of Economics, to the point where some of the most dogmatic Austrian economists will actively say that Hayek, for example, was not an Austrian economist, right? So that is the extent to which the debate rises, right? So let's consider these fundamental aspects of praxeology, right? Methodological individualism, radical subjectivism, and some form of a praxeology, or some kind of a logical deductive explanation of economic phenomena. These things are usually very bad methodological foundations, right? First of all, individualism. Why is it a bad methodological foundation? Because we know from everything related to the science of human beings that society influences us even before we are born, right? We are, in a sense, socially constructed before even we are alive, in the sense of having been born. So this is something really important to understand, right? That if you want to understand the behavior of individuals, sure, you can isolate the behavior of individuals and analyze it in an isolated manner, but what you cannot do is start from an abstract, isolated individual and believe that you can build an entire economic theory based on that. I mean, you can do it, but it's going to be very bad, right? So that would be the first thing, right? Abstracting from society from the very beginning of your economic analysis is not good, right? You want to see what is the social relations that exist in the context that you're studying. You want to see what are the incentives that are arising in those particular social structures. It's not as if, like in our methodology, we ignore the individual. We actually talk about the behavior of individuals a lot. It's just that we start from the premise that there are certain social structures that have a specific logic to them, and that is our starting point. But it is also in a constant, let's say, dynamic interaction with individual motives and with individual actions.
Yeah.
But we don't start from some isolated individual. Austrians do. Okay. The next thing is radical subjectivism. Again, it is basically unfalsifiable, right? The best Austrian economists usually will accept empirical testing in their theories to some degree, again, and they have some more nuanced versions of what subjectivism is and what its implications are. So like here, one of my professors actually at NYU, Mario Rizzo, has done, he's an Austrian economist, and he has done some really, really nice work on like subjectivism in the Austrian School of Economics and its implications and so on. But nevertheless, I think that radical subjectivism is usually not a good starting point either, right? Because usually the things that we're dealing with are objective social processes that do not need reference to subjective preferences in order to be understood. Now, they can be enriched by this appealing to subjective preferences, but they don't need them, right? Because usually they override them. Usually the aggregate outcomes override the individual preferences. And the next thing is praxeology, right? So praxeology starts from the axiom of human action, which says that all human action is purposeful and goal-oriented. If you look at this, I'm actually writing a research paper on praxeology, and I am looking at these claims very carefully, so I'm taking it very seriously. But if you look at it from this, from the standpoint of psychology, neuroscience, biology, this is false, right? This is a fundamentally false statement, right? Not all human behavior is purposeful and goal-oriented. Now, what is the trick? Because there is a trick. Praxeologists will actually tell you, no, this is true. This is an undeniable truth. Remember that praxeology starts from true axioms and derives true propositions from those axioms based on logical deduction, right? So remember, how can they say that this is true even though empirically such a statement is completely false? Okay, they will tell you, no, actually, we have defined action as purposeful, goal-oriented behavior. So anytime you do something, it is by definition an action in our description of the term, right? So it is impossible to falsify this statement, because by trying to falsify this statement, you're going to take an action described in these praxeological terms, and therefore you are contradicting yourself. This is the main thing that they like to do, right? This is what you can call a performative contradiction, which is a way of argumentation where you show that a proposition is true because denying it leads to logical contradiction. There's a very prominent guy in the Austrian School of Economics called Hans-Hermann Hoppe, who makes this claim all the time, and he's the one that has developed this further, because he is, actually I would call him, rather than an economist, I would call him a political philosopher. Usually he's really into epistemology, he has read a lot of Kant, so he's the one that formulates this in its more sophisticated sense. But even then, we can still show that this is not a good axiom, that this axiom is not representative of something real in the world, right? And that is what I'm writing about.
I'm very much looking forward to it. If it's up by the time that this episode goes up, then send us the link. Let people take a look. I'll take every opportunity to shit on praxeology.
Yeah, so it's probably not going to be, because there's a peer review process that it has to go through, etc. But the actual manuscript itself is finished. So I can probably send it to you if you want. But that's not the final thing. Just know
for sure, yeah.
that it's not
I
the
forget
final.
that you engage in real science. Unlike the praxeologists. Okay, I'll stop.
Yeah, so like I have to say that the Austrian School of Economics is a serious school, right? And I do have a lot of respect, especially for the better Austrian economists, right? People like Hayek, my own professor Mario Rizzo. Usually these people, they have some serious theories that you have to contend with, right? So it's not like just because we are here doing some very nice criticisms of praxeology and the likes that we can immediately say that all of Austrian economics is completely false.
Yeah.
That's not the way that I like to proceed in this sense. But these people are also very important political theorists as well, right? In the sense that
they're
they
ideologically
also talk a
motivated.
lot. But these people also talk a lot and they have relatively strong arguments in political philosophy. And usually in the Austrian School of Economics, there is also a further division, not only in methodological terms, in like the ones that are like very dogmatic praxeologists and the ones that are not, but there's also a very big divide in political theory, right? Where you have two strands, the minarchist strand and the anarcho-capitalist strand. And by no means are these unimportant differences, right? The minarchists and the anarcho-capitalists fight to the death almost in an argumentation sense of the word, right? Where these people have some serious disagreements. And here I usually like to read a lot the minarchists because they give really good criticisms of anarchy and especially of anarcho-capitalism, right? Which is something that we should also take serious. And to some extent, they also provide very good defenses of the state. Even though they claim that it has to be minimized to the maximum extent, but they nevertheless provide some good arguments in favor of why states should exist and why they produce stable social structures, right? That's the most important thing.
Beautifully said. And as just to add on and to kind of like give some structure to the liberals in the walls that yell, when people think anarcho-capitalist and minarchist, they usually think some guy with like a weird furry like drawing on a YouTube video getting 2,000 view reactions on, you know, like this kind of stuff. But the reality is, in every center-right to far-right government across the world, there's going to be some of these people advising either directly the Minister of Economy or Minister of Manufacture or Production and whatnot, or the actual direct leadership of the country, number one. So we do have to contend with the more serious aspects of these political positions. This is kind of an extension of why Marx attributed and called his entire economic study and discipline an approach to political economy, because these two things are intrinsically linked and cannot be separated as much as the modern institution of economics likes to separate them. That's the first point. The second point about the state, the justifications of the state in a transitional socialist sense is one that we defend. The eventual continuation of the state far, far into the future is not something that we support in like a foundational or even epistemological sense. It's something that will... like to borrow the Engels then turned into Leninist terminology, withering of the state, that will eventually happen. This is a theoretical axiom that we have in our approach to the socialist conception of the state. But when it comes to the ideas of maintaining state institutions as we transition from capitalism to pre-socialism and socialist socioeconomic formations, this is important for our own analysis. I'm just keeping this for the liberals in the walls because somebody will like, oh, but these three Marxists are sitting here and they're talking about the eventual, about the importance of the state. Yes, the state is very important, but there is a time limit on this, but not like the anarchists want. We don't stand for the immediate abolition of state institutions, especially when the material conditions for them have not yet evaporated. Moving on from this point, I would like to say you can actually take one or the other, because I don't want us to drag on too long. So I'm going to say both questions, and you feel free to answer what you want. The first question that I want to ask you is modern economic mythologies, the failures of Keynesian mechanisms that are most of the time just rebrand austerity, seemingly, at least in the modern sense, how they try to kind of create or rebrand the same procedures that they've used every crisis in and out, but as some new miracle cure with
And
interestingly
miracle
dwindling.
cruelty, yeah.
Exactly right.
How
Yeah,
it
it's
usually goes, yeah.
correct slip of the tongue. But they have,
Freudian slip wins again.
exactly right. Yeah, but there's this dwindling effect in the ability to shore up or protect some form of stability or base of the capitalist system. That's number one. And the second question is the current place or position of Marxist economics within the 21st century. Because we talk about, for example, the economic manuscripts, we talk about capital, we talk about capital, like wage labor and all these essays. But Marxism has progressed tremendously. Kantorovich himself, from Soviet times up until like the works of from Western Europe to China, and also the new school of Latin American economists, adding tremendous wealth to what Marxist economics is. What is the state of it now as a modern theory, quote unquote? You pick these two. If you want to answer both quickly, up to you.
Yeah, no, I would really like to answer both because I think both lead to similar conclusions.
Yes.
Let me first talk about neoclassical economics and Keynesian economics, right? So neoclassical economics arises historically, and there is a good historical argument to be made on this respect. It arises as a way of moving our attention, the economics profession, away from Marx, basically. Because all the way until Marx, the classical economists were the orthodoxy in the economics profession, right? And the labor theory of value was the orthodoxy, and all of the theories that were aligned with it, even some kind of a tendency of the rate of profit to fall, like that you can see in Ricardo already. And you can see also some what you can say like socialist leanings in Adam Smith, where he would say something like, okay, you shouldn't take the interests of the capitalist class at face value, because there is this distinction between the private profit-driven incentives of these people and the social benefit of the entire societal corpus, right? So even Adam Smith and David Ricardo had some of these ideas, and you can see a big tradition of socialism arising from Ricardo, which Marx was critical of, and Engels as well. But it is specifically with Marx that the classical tradition comes to a theoretical, let's say, coherence that is no longer ideologically convenient in a capitalist mode of production, right? It's no longer useful to ideologically justify the capitalist mode of production, and therefore new contending theories arise almost immediately. Like they were arising already with the Austrian school, which was developing, and some pre-Austrians were developing before. So you had the elements before, but it is really with Marx that this thing consolidates. And then you have the marginalist revolution, right? Which is this idea that you had all of these economists like Leon Walras and etc., who basically produced a theory that was classical in some senses, right? They still took things from the classical economists, but they left aside all of those things that weren't ideologically convenient, right? And even Walras's own father praised Walras's theory of general equilibrium precisely because it was not ideologically inconvenient, right? You can see and you can read this, that it's actually something that happened. So I think there's a good historical argument to be made that the neoclassical school arises as this, like, let's say, thing that is trying to counteract the culmination of the classical school of economics done by Marx, so as to make it ideologically convenient to the mode of production in which it exists. And you can see this from the very basic fact that in neoclassical economics, everything is idealized. In neoclassical economics actually doesn't deal with actual economies. It deals with idealized version of economies with purely theoretical concepts, and then it tries to apply those concepts to the real world. But because the real world never matches the theory, what they have to view the world as is imperfection, right? So when they try to understand the actual world, they start to talk about theories of imperfection, imperfect competition, imperfect trade, imperfect knowledge, imperfect whatever you can think of, right? Instead of looking at the real thing, they look at an idealized, purely theoretical thing that is ideologically magnificent, obviously, because it leads to the conclusion that everyone gets paid exactly what their marginal product is, so there's no big conflict here, class tensions, that is something completely irrelevant, all of that. But then, when explaining the actual world, because it doesn't reflect at all what the theory says, they have to explain it through imperfections, right? Mm-hmm. So in this neoclassical school that arises from these general equilibrium theorists, there was this idea that markets function perfectly on their own, right? So there's no need for a state because markets on their own do just good. In fact, not just good, they do optimally good. Immediately, right? So there's these two things. There's these two concepts that they offered. They offered an equilibrium between aggregate supply and demand, where the aggregate supply was so the level of output was determined by the full employment of labor and of the economy's resources, right? Which would be attained because in the market for labor, wages are fully flexible in such a way that whenever there is any move away from equilibrium, the wages will automatically adjust to bring the economy to full employment, right? And at this full employment level of output, the aggregate supply is determined, and the aggregate demand will immediately, so this is the second component, the aggregate demand will immediately adjust to the aggregate supply. Therefore, if you saw a crisis like in the Great Depression, where you saw suddenly a big decline in aggregate demand, the neoclassicals will tell you, okay, no problem, because the market is going to perfectly adjust. So what is going to happen is that with this decline, the output is still going to be at full employment, but there's just going to be a lower price level. There's just going to be a lower price level. What happened? That the Great Depression wasn't a very, let's say, straightforward, very quick recession that suddenly disappeared as it was theorized by the neoclassicals. It was actually a stable depression that was very far-reaching in its consequences and that was really socially disturbing, right? And this is the most important thing, that it was really disturbing not just to workers, but especially to capital, which is the thing that brings people into a state of shock in capitalist economies. Like, workers can suffer all they want, but if capital suffers, then we need to reconsider what we're doing wrong. So Keynes came into the picture as the savior of the economics profession, right? Where he said, okay, yeah, I mean, like, if the economy were at full employment output, we would see this rapid adjustment and whatnot. And if wages were fully flexible, we would indeed see this type of adjustments. What he said is, okay, first of all, it is not true that aggregate demand immediately adjusts to aggregate supply, and it is also not true that wages are fully flexible, right? So he included a new theoretical system that instead of, let's say, looking at this, let me be a little bit more nuanced. Like, Keynes himself was Marxist in some respects, right? Where he had a theoretical system that modern Marxist economists working in the classical Marxist tradition consider that was very close to some of the things that Marx was saying, right? So Keynes was more nuanced than the Keynesians, but the Keynesians specifically, they devised an economic model where through price rigidities and through a natural disequilibrium between the full employment level of output and aggregate demand, you could stimulate the economy via two things, via fiscal policy, so expansionary fiscal policy and expansionary monetary policy, so government spending and lower taxes and higher money supply, right? So he believed that with these things, you could indeed move the economy back to full employment level of output. So the economy itself wouldn't go there, but the government or the state, to put it in a better sense, the state can come in and make the economy be at full employment, at the perfect optimum equilibrium. what happens that, yes, this was actually the orthodoxy for some decades, but then came the 1970s and we had something called the Great Stagflation, where the usual Keynesian models, they suggested that there was a negative relationship between inflation and unemployment, where the higher the unemployment, the lower the inflation rate, right?
Yeah.
All right. So what did we see in the stagflation crisis? Higher unemployment, while at the same time the price level was rising in very big proportions. So this was a big empirical failure of the Keynesian models that led back to a retreat to the Walrasian neoclassical system. And what do we have now? A kind of a synthesis between these two systems, between what Keynes called the classical, even though it was neoclassical already, but between the what Keynes has called the classical and the Keynesian. And it's basically a system that tries to incorporate all of these imperfections, price rigidities, etc. But it nevertheless, I believe, still suffers from some fundamental theoretical problems related to the conception of competition that it uses, etc. Right? And that's basically for the neoclassical and the Keynesians. Now we come to Marxist economics, right? If you want me to touch
just
that.
Before that, I want to just say one note. When you do this regression back from the failure, Keynesian attempts at controlling and what they were hoping to was to eliminate eventually the cyclical nature of crises that capitalism goes through, is highly sophisticated, much more than any previous attempts. It is actually respectable what this man and what the school of thought has managed to achieve generally, but when a socioeconomic system has foundational contradictions that prevent it from ignoring or skirting these crises, and this tendency to cyclical crises, then there's only just so much you can do with these band-aids that you put on a system, and that's why these measures at the end of the day continue to fail. You can be as sophisticated as you want to be, but the foundational structure of the system has these inbuilt contradictions that will result in it to continuously and cyclically break down. Please enter into our grand finale of what modern Marxism, as an economic theory at the very least, has to deliver.
I think that this is a really good point in which to start talking about the modern importance of Marxist economics, because it is exactly the failure of both the neoclassical and the Keynesian systems that tell us that there is something that they are both doing in common that is mistaken, that we can improve upon with a different theoretical system, right? Here, I want to make it very clear that not all schools of Marxist thought have the same opinions, have the same theories, have the same conclusions, right?
Oh, leftists disagree? No, never. Come on.
It's not just that they disagree, it's that they disagree on some very critical issues, right? And here I want to stress that the school of thought that I am referring to when I call myself a Marxist, and when I think that we should incorporate these theories into the economic orthodoxy, is the school of thought that I'm referring to is the classical Marxist school of economic thought, right? Which is the school of thought that starts with the classical economists and culminates in Marx, and that has been further developed by economists working explicitly in this tradition. Here you have people like Sraffa, Anwar Shaikh, etc. Right? I would actually see one of the prominent figure in this school today is Anwar Shaikh, who actually is the one that is almost like giving this thing the name. He is calling it new classical economics to differentiate from neoclassical, right? Because neoclassical is something different. He's calling it new classical. And instead of talking about perfect or imperfect competition, he talks about real competition, which he shows is the theoretical foundation of the classical Marxist school of economics, right? Now, why is this school really important today? Not just in the past, but today. And here we have to understand that it is important because it precisely, radically departs from the perfect, imperfect notion of capitalism of the neoclassicals and of the Keynesians, right? And of the post-Keynesians. Why do we do this? Because instead of looking at the idealized version of capitalism and then explaining the real world as a deviation from that, we start from the real economic world, and from there we derive general economic laws, right? And this is a methodological, let's say, step that is really critically important in economic analysis, right? If you start from the right place, you will get to better conclusions. And in our work, every single economic law that we derive is founded not only on theoretical models full of mathematics and the likes, but especially on empirically observed patterns, which is why usually we can explain the things that both the neoclassicals and the Keynesians could not explain, while remaining a very mathematically sophisticated method of economic analysis, right? So it's not the math that is the problem. It's the way in which you use the math, beginning from a very specific theoretical starting point, right? And whether you use your math to be, let's say, guided by the empirical evidence, or whether you use the empirical evidence the other way around, or whether you use your math to fit the empirical evidence in a sense, right? Where what neoclassical economists will do, especially in the real business cycle theory and the likes, is to make the data fit their model instead of building a model that explains the data itself, right? So this is very important. And here there is a need for a coherent system, which I think is already well established and that we should begin to follow. And there's also the really important thing to notice, which is that in this school, things like imperialism, unequal exchange, monopoly power, etc., are important, but we do not consider them to be the defining features of the actual outcomes in economics, right? We still believe that it is competition, and real competition in particular, that determines these outcomes. So even though, again, monopolies, imperialism, unequal exchange, even though those things are real phenomena that exist, that have real world implications, we do not conceive of them as the determining factors of the actual economic outcomes, right? Which is a big difference that we have with other Marxist schools, which focus primarily on monopoly capital, on unequal exchange, dependency theory, and the likes, right?
Beautiful delivery and beautiful overview. As always, in the general scheme and normal tendency of all leftists, there are little points hither and thither that we disagree on, but the vast majority of the bulk of it is heavily aligned. But that's not the important bit. The important bit is that you are a lovely well of knowledge. We would love to have you on for many deeper discussions in the future, inshallah. Genuinely, it is a one thing that I love to see in the economic tradition particularly is this direct and scientific engagement with kind of these foundational principles of our world outlook when it comes to the economic side of things, at the very least, even into the modern day, because we tend to, like, as everybody gets into this field, we get bogged down in the classical works, and then, you know, like, people just stick in the 1800s before they kind of get sick of it and don't progress further. But this is a field. I always joke, it's as deep as all the world's oceans combined. There's so much that there's out there. We haven't even gotten to the different interpretations, the like single point theories, whatnot, all the various different interpretations of the labor theory of value, for example, and how it is operationalized within empirical studies. Maybe that's something we'll cover into the future. Thank you, Victor, for a fantastic overview today. Please let the people know where they can find you.
Yeah, so thank you very much for having me on. As a closing remark, I would also like to, let's say, share your spirit of scientificity and of non-dogmatism. Is really important, because one of the things that is in our school, especially in heterodox schools, but also in orthodox schools of economic thinking, one of the main issues that we face is precisely dogmatism, right? The Austrian school of economics has this problem. Marxists have this problem as well, and neoclassicals also have this problem. So we should be skeptical with our foundations at times. We should question things. We should engage in debate, honestly, and in a scientific spirit, right? And I, again, would like to thank you very much for having me here.
Absolutely.
It has been a wonderful time for me, and obviously, whenever you want me back to discuss many of the very complicated issues that we haven't talked about yet, I would more than love to. And you can find me searching my name, Victor Magariño. You can find me in YouTube. You can find me in Twitter. And again, you can also find me in some academic forums where papers are published and things are discussed.
All right, and with all that, we would like to thank our patrons, without whom this would not be possible at all. So thank you very much for all the love and support. We'd like to give an extra little shout out to our Habibi tiers, who we have regular monthly chats with, and a bunch of other secret fun stuff that you can check out on the Discord. So go check out the links in the description, and we'll be able to vibe together, hopefully, inshallah. With all that being said, this has been the Deprogram. I'm Hakeem.
I'm Yukopnik.
I am Victor, and I would like to spread my love and affection to everybody listening.
Hey, in true international
so
fashion.
wholesome.
I love
Beautiful, beautiful.
it.